Welcome everybody to navigating the spring heads. There are quite a number of heads that are basically we're going to be covering. So there'll be a couple of things that we will be doing, you know, kind of generally, and we'll talk you through some specifics. But what's really important to note is we have people here who are here for women's head, men's head, vet's head, school's head. And maybe you're doing more than one, and well done you. But please make sure, just a caveat, that you do go and take your time and go and have a look at the various websites and their up-to-date information. I have clocked that a couple of them are, some of them do still say 2024, because I was going through this kind of the detail to get ready for the presentation. And obviously for some of the head races, we are still quite a way out, but obviously we wanted to do it early to cover everything. So just make sure that you are actually going to go back and sort of check in and kind of look at what individual race you're basically going to be doing, so that you are basically switched on and ready to go. So we are going to launch straight into it. Read the rules, just going straight in. It's pretty obvious, I would like to assume, but just remember there are different rules and different course markers for each race, and you'll have marshals in different places. There will be slightly different rules, especially if you are doing multiple races. If you have done it time and time again, do not assume it's the same as last year. And some of our material where we have been trying to get you guys to come along, I think kind of the biggest misconception and mistake you can make about the Tideway is thinking that you know what the Tideway is going to do and you nail the Tideway every time. That's just not a thing. We've all been there, and ultimately, you know, the Tideway is always changing. The best line is always changing. You know, Zoe and I have been doing head races for 15 years. 15
more.
Years? More. I was being nice. We've been doing
20 plus.
Yeah, for a lot of years, and actually, you know, the best course is changing. The way that the races have run have altered slightly. So don't assume it's the same as last year, and make sure that you are hot on it. This is kind of a key metric for you as a cox, is making sure you are switched on and you are basically in charge of safety for the crew. And that's one of the most important things. And reading the rules and knowing where you need to be is one of those really important things. A couple of things to have a little think about, and this is the same for everybody, is thinking about how to prepare and what to pack. All of this is going to be available online, so don't worry about taking notes necessarily, but some of these key things that we think that you need to do now to think about how you can prepare, and you can start doing it now and then start thinking a little bit closer to the time. And this is something to talk to your crew about and also your coaches. So first thing to do is understand your timings for the day. You are likely to be boating from somewhere that is going to be very busy. That club is going to be hosting lots of different crews. You may well be boating on somewhere where there is limited space to get a boat down. So, for example, if you are going from Putney Town, you can only get one boat down those steps at a time. Or if you're at Fulham Reach, again, you're limited with how many boats that need to be on the water. So you need to have an idea of when you need to boat, and what does that look like on the day? Do you have time to pre-paddle? When is the race actually happening? And essentially kind of managing all that time. My big piece of advice was, if you want to do kind of a big pre-race chat, is make sure you do that way in advance, just in case there's a big queue when you're trying to get your boat down. So give yourself way more time than you think. A really important thing, which we'll come into a little bit as well when we're looking at the race, is look at who is around you. You will have an idea of sort of how well your crew is going, but this is probably the first kind of opportunity to put yourself against those other clubs, whether, you know, regardless of kind of what club you are in, you will have those clubs that are closer to you and those clubs that you're kind of aspiring to go and beat. Look at who is around you. It's really useful to know blades of the ones around you, know the numbers of the ones around you as well, and if you kind of knowing the name of the club, there's also kind of like that 3-letter code, which can help you understand. It'll mean you'll communicate better with the crews around you if you're needing to get past them. And it'll also help you think about how you might want to go about your race and what you might expect as the race comes. Discuss and consider what your warm-up should be and your race plan. I'm going to be going into a little bit of detail on the marshalling, but depending on where you're boating from, that will really impact your ability to warm up, because in all of these 4 races we're talking about, you cannot be doing race pace bursts on the inshore zone in the marshalling area. So you're going to need to think about, what does your warm-up look like? If you're boating from right down by Chiswick, chances are you're not going to get a lot of water-based warm-up. If you're going from Putney, that's great. You will have loads of time. But if anything, you might have too much time and you're going to be on the water for a while. What you don't want to do is go and get people really hot, and then they're just going to get cold and just sit there in damp kit for the best part of 45 minutes to an hour. Understanding the logistics and the rules of the race. We're going to be going on about that so much because it's so important. Understand basically how the race works, and hopefully this is going to give you a really good understanding of that. And if you get to the end and you think, oh, I'm still not quite sure about that, you can either go back and watch the recording, but also make sure you go and have a look online at your various race rules. And lastly, very relevant, check the PLA flag status and the weather. We're going to be talking a little bit more about the weather in a minute, but obviously we've all been there. We're all gearing up to a head race, and then all of a sudden, you know, it's red boards, we're not going rowing. We're having it at the moment with all of us in our various training environments. So just be aware, you may not have as much time on the water as you might like in advance. And if the stream is running really high, think, you know, that's going to impact the way that the race runs. They might even end up cutting numbers and things like that, or even shortening a course. If we're thinking about what to pack, I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs, but this is just a good thing for you to come back to. Very, very important things just for the Tideway is making sure you have wellies if you are wading in. You do not want to be walking in sliders and then sitting in the boat cold. It's also not the cleanest. We've all seen all of the stuff going around about water quality. So making sure that you are being really hot on your hand hygiene, and also that also comes down to, you know, if you're wading in and you might have cuts on your feet or anything like that, just make sure you've got wellies. And the other thing is making sure you have enough kit to be warm. This is really important. I don't want to kind of see any coxes just going down there in skins because they think that couple of kilos of kind of a life, you know, like the big waterproof is going to make the difference. I promise you it won't. If you are cold, you will not be switched on. You will not be able to make the calls. You will not be reactive. A warm cox is a far more efficient cox than a cox that is trying to drop dead weight, because you know that, you know, the athletes will have probably a load of kit that's just sitting in their footwells as well. So just make sure you're warm. But you can come back and have a look at that as a little checkpoint before you get going.
Just to add to the hygiene, I would say make sure you get water bottles that have some sort of lid on them, because if they just have the spout, you know, that you kind of pull out with your teeth, if that's then sitting around in water, in the Tideway water, that essentially just means you're kind of taking a sip of the Tideway water every time you drink. So try and get your athletes to make sure they have water bottles with proper lids on.
Yeah, that's a great shout. Here, we're just talking a little bit about weather. We have all been victims of the weather recently. We had that mad wind that was happening at the end of last week. And obviously, as coxes, it's going to impact your racing, but the time that is going to probably impact you even more is actually during marshalling. If you are sat there for quite a long time, you've got kind of, you know, you're bow to stern with other boats around you, it's actually super important that you're aware of what the weather's doing. If it's a crosswind, if it's a headwind. If it's a crosswind, make sure you're pointing your bows into the wind where possible, just so then you're not basically being pushed around. What you don't want to do is end up accidentally grounding yourself if you're on the flats and marshalling there and losing a rudder. And also just take a look at how the wind direction is going to impact you over the course as well. Kind of understanding that on the Tideway, based on how it looks, that you will have different weather in different parts. If the weather is any more than sort of 6-7 miles per hour, you're going to start to feel it. And also being aware that obviously we are going with the tide, but if we're getting kind of that wind against stream, then you are more likely to have more of an impact, as in it's going to create more white caps, it's going to be bouncier water. So knowing where that's going to come in the race is really useful. If we have a little look here, we've got Windy, which is an kind of an app that most of us should be using. It's really useful. It's free online. Download the app, you get an idea of where it is. And you can basically get up-to-date information on kind of what are the speeds, what are the gusts looking like, what is the wind direction going to be around the time of race time, and also get an idea of what's it going to look like while you're doing your pre-paddles and your warm-up and things as well. If I show you here, based on the wind previously, this is obviously a Google Maps version, you basically, let's assume that we're starting. So the start is down here for anyone who's not familiar on the bottom left. We're going to be going through all of this in quite a lot of detail shortly. But if you are basically going off the start, you're looking at a relatively sort of helpful, potentially cross-tail as you're coming up the start in the first couple of K. As you start to push through Barnes Bridge, it starts to become a lot less useful. Again, then you're hitting a lot more of a crosswind. So being aware of, okay, how is that going to impact me? We will have people marshalling all the way through and past Barnes Bridge. So if you are in that higher number of crews, you've got a kind of bow number that's in the multiple hundreds, you're going to be hit by this crosswind. So being aware of that and being basically friendly to the people around you. I actually think this is something that's so important. We talk a lot at WOX about fleet management, you know, particularly around racing, but actually fleet management is so important when essentially we're all marshalling together. We are all people potentially there on a windy day because we have a love for the sport that we're all basically getting stuck into, and actually being a pain in the ass because you're not moving up and you're pushing another crew kind of into the bank is just not helpful. That's not what we want to do. You want to be a cox that basically makes room for other people, that enables, you know, everyone to get to the start line safely. And so ultimately you can do all your talking on the water in the racing. That's what's most important. So just keeping an eye, and then obviously you can see as you come up to the top around St. Paul's, past the Chiswick Steps, it turns again into a more helpful tailwind, so making the most of that. But then as you come around the turn, I can almost see it in my head, you're coming around that turn, then all of a sudden you're going to get some big gusts coming along as you go along on Harrods and the milepost because it's quite exposed. So be aware of what the wind's doing, be smart about it, and pick parts of the race that's going to be most helpful to you, and be aware of basically when it's not going to be helpful for you as well. I think we might have mentioned this already, but listen to the marshals. As you're getting down to the start line, there are going to be marshals all over the place. They're going to be mostly in tin fishes, basically milling around. They will be talking to you through megaphones. I always think that because marshals have megaphones, and they need megaphones because they need to be heard, they always sound angrier than they are because they're trying to project their voice and tell you what to do. They are trying to manage the race and ensure everyone is safe. So they're probably not going to be like, Leander, please can you tap up? Thank you. They're going to be like, Leander, tap up. Leander, tap up more. Okay, good. Thank you. Maybe a thank you. But they are there to make the race efficient and smooth. So when you're marshalling, listen to the marshals. They will help you, particularly at the crossing points as well. If you need to cross, they'll be there. And even if you think it's safe to go, but the marshal asks you to wait, don't get frustrated. Take the time. You will have enough time, providing you've worked it into your program, and just wait and basically respond to them. This is also really, really important that you're really switched on and listening to the marshals when it comes to turning for the start, managing the finish, and basically getting home safely, because these are the times when your athletes are probably going to be least switched on, because they're maybe doing a bit of faff and taking an extra layer off, even though you've already told them to dekit when you're turning to go. It may well be that they are, well, probably pretty knackered by the time you've finished, but it's really important that you keep on rowing after the race. All these sorts of things. Listen to marshals. And this is not just basically us saying listen to the marshals because it's important. You must listen to the marshals because they have the power to also basically penalize on time, or you could even get disqualified. This is not because they're wielding power. This is just because it's super, super important for them to basically try and ensure a safe and a fair race. So if in doubt, listen to the marshals. If you didn't hear what they said, just stop rowing and just ask again, because sometimes it is a little bit hard to hear. It's all a little bit frantic. They are there to help you, so use them if you need. So getting into a couple of bits and bobs of logistics actually before the race, we would advise if you're going from Putney to give it at least an hour. That might sound a bit mad, But bear in mind that even if you've been on the Tideway before, you are going to be moving down to the start with a couple of hundred crews. And basically every time you go past a boathouse, tens more crews are also going to join you. Then you'll get to a point, obviously, if you're trying to get quite far down, even potentially below Chiswick, you've then got boats that are stopped and marshalling all the way around you as well. So it's going to be busy. It's going to be kind of like the M25 on a really busy day. Give it plenty of time. Even if you're coming from Hammersmith, give it 40 minutes to get in position. Providing you make sure that everyone's got enough kit, everyone's got some snacks, everyone's got enough water. It's better to be just on the water and waiting than being panicky about trying to get to the start line on time. What's really important is we stick to normal navigation until we reach the marshalling area. So make sure that you understand which way the tide is going and when the tide is turning as well. And so that means you can stick safely to normal navigation until you hit the marshalling area. The time that is most impactful is obviously when you're on the inshore zone where you normally wouldn't be based on that tide. I'm going to show you what the marshalling area looks like for all those different races that we're talking about. In all races, nothing other than paddling is permitted in the marshalling area. So that is definitely no starts and high rate. If you want to keep people warm, you could maybe do some paddling and a bit of like plus 10%. So you could maybe do sort of a little bit more powerful paddling, but generally you need to have done all your warm up by the time you hit that marshalling area. That's really important. And this is, I know, marshalling bugbear is fill the gaps. You'll hear that a lot, especially if you're sat in the marshalling area for a while. What they're trying to do is basically just keep the bunch of boats, which is generally in 50s, quite tight together. And they're doing that for a reason, because basically by the time then you're paddling up, getting ready to turn to start your piece, you don't want loads of really big gaps, because what that ends up doing is pulling out and dragging out the racing, and that it really messes up with the timings. So try and fill those gaps. As I said, get to know the crews alongside you, work with them, make sure everyone's got the space they need, and actually you can have quite a nice time marshalling. So I'm not going to go into full depth with everybody, but you can see here the 4 different races that we've got on. What's really important to note is obviously depending on what number you are, depends what side you are. And that is where it's really important when you get into that marshalling area that you may need to cross into the opposite inshore zone. So for example, you look at Women's Head, which is coming up next weekend. You've got even numbers on Middlesex, odd numbers on Surrey. And it's such a small thing. Yeah, you've got even and odd. I actually can't see, it's such small numbers there. But basically, you need to just have a little bit of a look. So if you're D135, that's the odd numbers, so you're up there. And then if you've got kind of the white numbers, what they tend to do as well is if you're on different sides, you may have different coloured bow numbers. They've done that in some years, not in every year. That can be helpful. But everyone's got bow numbers on. The coxers will be wearing them on their backs as well. So you can have an idea of where you need to be. And if in doubt, ask a marshal. So make sure you understand where you need to be. If you don't know before you boat. That's really important. And just make sure you fill the gaps and have a look at the various races that you're doing and what the instructions are for marshalling. In terms of the race itself, nobody will wait for you to start. So when it comes to starting procedure, you will have marshalled. By then, you are below Chiswick Bridge. You are all there in a pack, no gaps, you're ready to go. And then basically a marshal will go down with a megaphone and ask you to start turning. So what you want to do, which is really important, which Zoe will touch on when she talks about the start of the race, is making sure you get into the middle of the race, basically, because you're going to be right in the bank, that you want to be getting into the middle and ready to start. You may tap turn, maybe you go, just legs only, bow side or whatever. Make sure you're really clear in the turning and make sure you are ready to go. By the time you're turning, there's no time to dekit. You need to be ready to race, and nobody will wait for you. As soon as you're told to turn, just turn and get going. Zoe's going to touch on this when she gets into the race itself, but the start is at the University Stone after Chiswick Bridge, and that's the same for every single race. So don't panic and go too early and start your race pace at Putney, because you're going to be about 300-400 meters too early. So turn, get paddling, paddle with a little bit of pressure, and then make sure you know where that start is. You must pass through the center arch of all bridges, and you must be on the fairway. So the fairway, I've talked about the fairway and the inshore zone. For those of you who are less familiar with the Tideway, the fairway is basically the middle main stretch. The inshore zone are basically channels on either side of that main zone, and they are marked by buoys. Basically, if you are racing, Zoe's going to talk about where the line is, but generally speaking, if you're vaguely in the middle, you're going to be safe and in the right place. Don't be on the edges. Don't think, oh, that looks like a shortcut. It isn't. Stick in the middle. And this is something that's so important for all of us. Same rate, same rules across all of these different ones is you must safely give way to overtaking crews. So there is penalties will be given out if you are not giving way to overtaking crews. You must safely give way to overtaking crews. There is a responsibility on all crews to avoid a collision. So if you are the crew that is overtaking, you cannot aggressively barge into another boat and force them into something that's unsafe and then cause a collision. It should be something where there's kind of sportsmanlike behavior, where if you are the slower crew, you give way to the overtaking crew to allow them to take their line that they're basically setting themselves up to race. And then you can, whether you can tuck back in or whether you're actually happy with where you are, you can stick with where you are. Zoe's going to talk about it, but the fastest channel on the Tideway is not one boat wide. So if you are smart about the way that you're moving and the way that you're overtaking, you can both very much sit in the stream. There is no kind of magic escalator that it is only 4 meters wide. And then I'm going to hand over a little bit to Zoe to talk a little bit about kind of managing your race.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I'm going to go through and talk a bit about the race. These are the landmarks and the distances. What I would say is that these are the distances for broadly the Vets Head, the Women's Head, and the Men's Head. School's Head is slightly shorter. So the finish position for School's Head is at Ranelagh Boat Club, or Ranelagh Sailing Club, sorry, which is sort of halfway down the Putney Embankment. Whereas for the others, it's at the University Stone or the pier, which are basically more or less the same. So the School's Head is going to be a couple 100 meters shorter. That was the previous School's Head last year. That was the finish position. So I would recommend that you check it again, because I don't think the School's Head have their updated information yet on the website. But have a good look so you know where that finish line is if you're racing School's Head, and be aware it is going to be slightly shorter. Bear in mind you're on the Tideway, so you know that couple 100 meters is going to go by very, very quickly. But these are your rough distance markers, and if you want to now, you can get your phone out and take a little picture just in case you don't want to watch this back later. But yeah, these are the ones that you should be the most aware of, and I'm going to go through during the talk what all these markers mean and what they are. So the start, like Erin said, the start is just after Chiswick Bridge. It's a good few strokes past. What I would start thinking about, though, with the line is actually from the moment you turn. So like we discussed before, you're going to be very tight into the bank when you're marshalling. You're going to be asked to turn, and you could be on either side of the river when you're asked to turn. You need to make sure that you actually turn into more or less the middle of the river. That sounds really obvious, but I see so many crews doing a tap turn at the side of the river and then having to row themselves over into the middle. The lovely thing about the Tideway is the stream will help you. So if you start to angle your bows out into the middle of the river, the stream's going to do a lot of the work for you by spinning you round. Everything I talk about from here on in, I'm going to talk about from the Cox's point of view, but I know that we do have some steers people who are watching this. So bear in mind that I am talking about this from the Cox's point of view. But in terms of where you should be on the river, this applies whether you're in a single or an 8. So the start, we are getting ourselves all lined up. and hopefully we've got a nice picture here of Chiswick Bridge. You're going to turn, depending on where you are in your division, you might be quite close to the bridge, or you might be a good few hundred meters further up the river. So you want to line yourself up to put yourself in the best position to start. I always aim to be just to the right of centre. So I want to be going through Chiswick Bridge just to the right of centre, but with my bows pointed ever so slightly over to the left-hand side. The absolute vital thing to remember on the Tideway is that if you keep your boat parallel to the shore, you're likely to be following the line of the stream, okay? If you're at funny angles to the shore, then you're going to be across the stream, which can be really uncomfortable to row in. On top of that, though, it's important, and you can see this if you look at a good Google map shot of the Tideway, that the bridges aren't actually parallel. They don't go at 90 degrees across the river. They're all at a bit of a funny angle. So actually, you're not going to come through any of the bridges at exactly sort of 90 degrees. So you're going to aim to go through Chiswick Bridge slightly to the right of centre, but with your bows pointed towards the left. Because for the first part of the race, from Chiswick Bridge all the way round to Barnes Bridge, you're going to be more or less 1/3 from the left-hand side and 2/3 from your right-hand side. With all of this stuff, if you just stay in the middle, if you stay bang in the middle for the whole race, you're not going to go too wrong. So if all else fails, just head straight to the middle. But this is going to be the optimum line, is going to be about 1/3 from the left, 2/3 from the right. So you're going to go through Chiswick Bridge with your bows pointed slightly to the left. The start is going to be a good few strokes after the bridge. And it's really important to have a good plan about how you're going to get up to pace. Different crews do it differently. I would always be aiming to be at pace just as my bow, also probably just as my maybe foreseat comes out from under Chiswick Bridge. So I'm giving myself, 4 or 5 strokes at pace. So I'm not missing the start, but equally you don't want to be going at full pace before you even hit Chiswick Bridge, because then you're giving yourself a lot of extra work. So we're going to hold that 1/3 from the left, pretty much all the way around to Barnes Bridge. As you see, you'll see that there's a pub just before the bridge on your right-hand side. It's called the White Hart. It's really obvious because there's actually not a huge amount over on that side. There's a big brewery. You can see it actually on the map now. That's not that far after the start. And then the next major thing really along there is the White Hart pub, which is just before the bridge. As you get level with the White Hart, you want to just allow yourself to drift out into the middle a little bit more to allow yourself a nice passage through Barnes Bridge. Hopefully we've got a good shot of Barnes Bridge here as well. When you come round towards Barnes Bridge, before you get to the White Hart, you're going to feel like you're aiming for that buttress that's just to the left of the centre arch, and you're going to think, I'm not going to make it. But you will. You'll get swept around. And as you reach the White Hart, you just allow yourself to drift out into the middle, because you want to be aiming to go through Barnes Bridge, ideally with your bow side blades, or sort of the shaft of your bow side blades just under the middle. So it's ever so slightly to the left of centre. But again, you want to be doing this pointing to the left. And a good, I'd say, sort of 20 or 30 degrees, because Barnes Bridge is really not straight across the river. And I'm going to show you, so Barnes Bridge, we're now 1.2k in. I'm going to show you the reason why it's so important to be pointing to the left in this next slide that comes up. We talk a lot about the Fulham Flats, which is much further down towards the other end of the race. And you might hear people saying, oh yeah, the Fulham Flats, you don't want to get stuck over there. It's really shallow. The water goes really slowly. In my opinion, this stretch at Barnes Bridge on the right-hand side here, so the outside of the bend, is just as bad, if not worse. It's really, really shallow. And you can see this is a picture from a relatively low tide. If you look at the right, all that darkness, that's the bank. And that's how shallow it is over that side. And I see a lot of crews who will come out of Barnes Bridge at 90 degrees to Barnes Bridge, which means they end up pointing over to the right. They go really, really wide here, and they end up on that flat, and immediately they lose speed. So again, from Barnesbridge, after you've exited Barnesbridge, you want to be aiming again to be around a third from the left, 2/3 from the right. And that is going to sweep you all the way round past Chiswick Pier, which is about 2.2k, which is a sort of, sorry, towards Chiswick Pier, which is a sort of, well, it's a pier with boats moored on it. And at that point, you're going to start again edging out into what's more the center of the river. However, because the way the pier sticks out, and then after the pier, there's a line of moored boats, you're going to feel like you're much closer to that left-hand side. You're going to feel quite close to the pier, and you're going to feel quite close to those moored boats. I would always aim to be maybe to be able to fit one more boat in between me and the pier, so an entire boat including blades. So you want to be able to fit an entire boat comfortably between you and the pier, but you're still going to feel much closer at that point to the pier than you do to the right hand side, and we're going to see a picture of that in just a second. So here we go. This is the pier. You can see what I mean here. So even at this point, if you're in the middle of the river, you're going to feel much closer to those boats that are moored up there on the left-hand side. And again, you can see the reason why you're starting to shift away from 1/3 to the left is because of that shallower area on the left-hand side. So at this point, what I try and do is I try and change my focus to the right-hand bend, to the right-hand side of the river. So I'm trying to hold my line now off the right-hand side. And this is an important corner not to cut. I mean, all of the corners you shouldn't be cutting, but this one in particular, you don't want to cut. So you want to be in the center of the river here. But like I say, you're going to feel closer to Chiswick Pier and to those moored boats. And this is going to sweep you round now to the Ayot, or the island, Chiswick Island, which again, hopefully we have a picture of. Here we go. So the important thing to remember about the island, as you can see from this bird's eye view, is that it's not straight. So you need to be careful at this point to not follow the line, the curve of the island. This is why I say I switch my focus to the right-hand bank. So at this point, you want to be keeping your boat parallel to that right-hand bank. Along here, the point that I aim for is there's a pole now that's right on the end of the island, so the further end of the island as you're racing, and then there's a buoy, a navigation buoy on the right hand side, almost exactly level with it, and I aim to be in the middle of those two things. So again, you're going to be further to the middle. In fact, at this point, really over the whole river, you're probably slightly closer to the right-hand side, but because of where the island is, you're going to feel closer to the island. So again, you want to hold that distance now all the way round from the island, which is going to be about 2.8k. You're going to go past the halfway marker, which is some blue door. It's called the blue doors. It's a set of blue doors on your left-hand side. It's not a particularly useful marker, if I'm being entirely honest.
I hate it. The number of times I've completely missed it. But what I normally reference is by the time you can see there's that block of flats, which are flats, kind of townhouses beyond it, you know that if you haven't seen the blue doors, but you can see those buildings, you're past halfway.
Yeah, I'd say the only marker that's less useful is the Chiswick Steps. Nobody knows where those are. It's just like everyone thinks there's someone different. And I mean, yeah, so don't bother with those either. So at this point, you're going to be kind of, as the river, for the river on the whole, you're going to be now slightly closer to the right-hand bank. So just over the sort of the center line to the right. But again, because of the island, and then because of the Dove Pier, which is coming up next, you are again going to feel like you're a little bit closer to the left at some of these points. But again, a very important corner not to cut. So you get your line from the right-hand side, halfway between that buoy and the pole at the end of the air, and then you just hold that distance from the right-hand bank all the way around that corner. Don't be tempted to see the corner and start cutting into it. You're going to keep your boat parallel to the shore. That's going to sweep you all the way past St. Paul's School, which is on your right-hand side, and it's a fairly dull-looking sort of one-story boathouse, but with a big slipway that comes down into the river. That's about 3.6k. And then from there, you've got 500 meters until you get to Hammersmith Bridge. So you've held that line from the right-hand side. Now, as we go into Hammersmith Bridge, this is kind of the iconic steering point, really, of the entire race. So if we get up our picture of Hammersmith Bridge, oh, and it's nicely highlighted on there for us. You are going to aim to go under the second lamppost from the middle. So this lamppost is the place that everyone will be aiming for. There's often a bit of a group of supporters clustered around there as well, because they know that's the racing line. My personal opinion is that you could be slightly inside it these days. I think the river is now actually running quite quickly round the inside of that bit tighter, basically. So you can be a little bit inside that. So as in to the right of it, so closer to the right-hand buttress, but only a tiny bit. If you are smack bang underneath that lamppost, you're doing a good job. But once again, you need to make sure you're not going through at 90 degrees. But now the river is changing direction. So now we're going to be pointing with our bows to the right. So about 20, 25, 30 degrees to the right. So a good point to the right, because pretty much now all the way down from Hammersmith, all through pretty much the sort of Barn Elms, we are going to be holding that same 1/3 from the right, 2/3 from the left. Now, this is a really great picture taken off Hammersmith Bridge. You can see in the background on the right-hand side, there's a red navigation buoy. That's just outside the Harrods Depository, which is a big building on the right-hand side. Personally, I would be aiming to be fairly close to that red buoy. I'd again probably give just enough space for one boat to get in between me and that red buoy. So I would be much, much closer than that crew that you can see out front there. And you can see here that the angles are all completely different. So the boat closest to the camera on the right-hand side is pointing far too far to the left. So they've come through Hammersmith Bridge really, really tight there. The boats on the left-hand side closest to the cameras are probably pointed in the right direction, but are too far to the left. So where I'd want to be is kind of in between those two boats that are closest to the camera, but pointing more round as if I'm going to start going round that corner. So again, parallel to the bank, not at 90 degrees to the river.
This is probably just a good point to say. We had a couple of questions about sort of overtaking and things like that. So, for example, what you have here is actually both crews, which look like, let's assume the ones that are behind, but kind of they're going to make an overtake. They are thinking ahead about being in a better place when you come round basically the crew. So looks like maybe something with a 2, that's basically on the left hand side of your screen, that closer crew. Let's work on the fact that the crew behind is actually going to make an overtake. They are smarter, let's assume they are in the right place in the river, but they are smarter by being on that inside of the bend and taking that line. So they're not being forced out wide and basically kind of having to take a really wide sweeping line, and to some extent probably being pushed out further by the crew that they're overtaking. So one thing to think about when you're overtaking, if you're coming up on another crew, is not where am I, you obviously want to be thinking where you are right now, but actually an overtake often takes a lot longer than you think, and probably a lot longer than anyone would like. Therefore, you almost need to be thinking in half a kilometer's time, or kind of 750, even a K, where do I want to be? And if we're talking about being on that right hand third or the left hand third, is making sure that you line yourself up so when the overtake happens, that crew in front is following the rules and concedes to you. It's very clear that you're going to take your racing line. So just thinking about that here, because it may well be that the crews do get closer together in the second half of that race.
Okay, so you've shot away from Hammersmith Bridge. Hammersmith Bridge, about 2.7k from Hammersmith Bridge to the finish. You go past Harrods Depository, which is another 500 meters down the river. You get to this really dead zone, and I'm going to talk a little bit about race plans and how you can manage this part of the race. But you're pretty much going to hold now that 1/3 from the right, 2/3 from the left, all the way down to Barn Elms. There are quite a few navigation buoys on your right, and they kind of start closer to the bank and then slowly inch out generally. So do keep an eye on those and make sure you're aware of where they are coming up. But yes, essentially you're going to hold that line all the way down to around Barn Elms, which is another sort of one-story boathouse. I think we might have a picture of it actually, and a slipway that runs down into the water. It's roughly opposite Craven Cottage, which is the big Fulham Football Club stadium. Variously, some of you will have seen it with some work going on outside, with big riverboats moored outside. It's quite crowded over now by Fulham, especially if it's a match day. So just be aware that at that point, you still want to be around a third from the right-hand side, 2/3 from the left, because there's quite a lot going on over there sometimes. So you're going to come now. I think great. So the top picture is Barn Elms. At Barn Elms, you want to start edging again into the middle of the river, so coming towards the left. And that's because you need to pass the Black Buoy. The Black Buoy is yellow to start with, so don't be surprised. There will almost always be a marshal in a tin fish in a launch tethered to the end of it, because they want to make sure that you're not going to hit it. But essentially, it is to mark the start of this line of moored boats that travels down the Putney Embankment. And in the bottom picture, glorious sunshine, flat water, the Tideway as we love it. You can see the Putney Embankment at the top of the picture. And then in the water, you can see that line of moored boats that separates the inshore zone from the fairway. So the Black Buoy is starting that all off. And again, you want to give yourself a little bit of room from the Black Buoy. I, again, aim to be able to fit roughly one boat with blades in between myself and the Black Buoy. I would say if I was feeling feisty, I might get a bit closer. I might aim for just one blade's length. But if you allow space for one boat to be in between, then you're going to be in a good place. And you're going to hold that line pretty much against the line of moored boats all the way down. So it's about 600 meters from the Black Buoy to the finish, unless you're doing the School's Head, which is a little bit before. But you're going to hold that line down the line of moored boats until you get roughly level with London Rowing Club, which if you look at that picture of the embankment on the bottom, it is on the left-hand side. It's the first full building you can see with the sort of white bit at the top that's kind of taller, slightly taller than all the buildings to its right. That's London Rowing Club. Once you get level with London Rowing Club, just aim for the very centre of the centre arch of Putney Bridge, and that's going to take you to the finish line. Like we said, the finish line will be sooner for the School's Head. Ranelagh Sailing Club is, I'm trying to look at this picture that's tiny on my screen, is basically about halfway down that line of moored boats. It's quite a little skinny little building, but there should be a big sign on it that says finish. It should be pretty obvious, but you won't be going as far as that London Rowing Club at the end of the embankment. So you've got to the end of the race. We'll leave what you do next up to Erin to come back to. But I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how you manage that race itself. I have an extremely simple race plan, which I use every time I race on the Tideway. I listen to lots of race recordings, we all do, and I think one of the things that we hear a lot of is really, really complicated race plans. I would say keep it simple. Rowers tend to be fairly stupid when they're, oxygen deprived 10 minutes into this race. They don't need something super complicated. And to be honest, I can't remember really complicated race plans, which is why I always stick with my nice simple one. Remember that you are going to be the voice in the rower's head, especially as you get further and further down this course. So you need to make sure that your calls are really, really simple, concise, and clear so that they know what you are expecting of them. Here is my race plan. So the start is probably the bit where I am the most varied, depending on which crew I'm in, because different crews have different ways of attacking the start. Some crews want to go up really high on the rate and then kind of stretch out onto a good race pace. Some want to kind of just go out at race pace and just be aggressive and hold it like that. But I tend to use the bit between Chiswick Bridge and Barnes Bridge as just a real focus on rhythm and really strongly pushing into a good, solid race pace. At every bridge, and by every bridge, I mean Barnes Bridge and Hammersmith Bridge, I do the same things. So I do a 20-stroke focus on catches, more or less, going into the bridge. And I will talk to my rowers about, using the visual of the bridge. So imagine, spearing your blade back towards the bridge, that kind of thing. So I'll do those 20 catches into the bridge, and then I get them to do 20 finishes out of the bridge. And those catch or finish calls are going to be dependent for me on what my crew is working on specifically. So for some crews, it might be being longer at the catch. For some crews, it might be sitting up at the catch or being looser at the catch. And then on the finishes, it might be about really pressing out through the foot plate, or it might be, really pressing those knees down to the deck or drawing up high. But I'm focusing on those separate parts of the stroke. And the reason I like doing finishes out of the bridge is because they can physically lift their heads up, look at the bridge, and imagine pushing away from the bridge. And that's why I quite like using a finish focus there. And then what I do from the bandstand, which is another fairly useless marker, it's basically like a little, well, it's a bandstand, it's like a little sort of circular outdoor structure on the left-hand side, but essentially like a minute or so after Barnes Bridge, I like to focus on, I do these 5x20 technical focuses. So those, again, the technical focuses will be based on the crew I'm with. So they've got to be appropriate for the crew, things that we have been working on, things that we've discussed before. But what I like to do is I like to try and do it in a cyclical fashion. So the rowing stroke is cyclical, and I like to build my technical focuses in a cyclical fashion. So for example, what that might mean might look like something, okay, the first 20 strokes is going to be about being really loose on the catch, really loose on the catch. Maybe there's a bit of a headwind there, so just being direct into the headwind, getting bow pair to really lead that and pick up the rest of the boat. So that's my first 20-stroke focus. Then I go into my next 20-stroke focus, and that might be, we've just done putting our blades in the water, so that might be really picking up the first 2 inches of the stroke. So getting connected, out there long, holding on, feeling that squeeze through the glutes, getting that connection. My third 20-stroke focus might be really driving those knees down to the deck. So we're picking up from that first 2 inches, and now our next 20 is driving those knees down to the deck, really pressing out as one crew. My fourth 20-stroke focus, then picking up from where I left off, might be about holding out that finish and just getting that sweep back out again onto the front of the seat. So pressing out the finish and then allowing our hands to come away together, moving off the back together onto the front of our seat. And then my final 20-stroke finish focus might be then just really gliding out together. So relaxing on the slide, letting us, come out, gliding out long, because then that brings us right back round to our catches again. So we've built a cyclical focus. Each focus is building on the next. And that 5x20 stroke focus can take you a long way round that big Surrey bend. Mine probably take more than 100 strokes because I probably do 20 strokes and then I kind of set up the next one. So that's, takes 3 strokes and then I do my next 20 focus. But that'll take you quite a long way round the bend if you use it right. Coming round sort of St. Paul's, Hammersmith, there's more supporters there. There's more noise. You can use that, play off that, maybe some slightly more energetic calls, yeah, those shouts are for you, that kind of thing, like get people up for that second half of the race. And then I'm going to do my same 20 catches into the bridge, 20 catches out of Hammersmith Bridge. And then you get to that sort of real dead patch after Harrods. It gets quiet, Harrods, the milepost. So what do? I do my 5x20 focuses all over again. Exactly the same, exactly in the same order. Whatever works for my crew, I repeat them. And then, like I say, that'll take you quite a good way round towards the milepost, towards the end of the race. And then, again, the finish is going to be different for your different crews. It's going to be whether you build rate, whether you just build speed, whether you're just aiming to keep a consistent speed over the whole course. That's going to be a bit more personal to you. What I want to kind of get across by this race plan, though, is how simple I make these race plans. I think ultimately, in a time trial situation, I'm not doing lots of big pushes, like just aggressive power-based pushes, because ultimately it's about sustaining your speed from A to B. You might need a little bit more power sometimes, maybe if you're in a difficult overtake position and you want to kind of have a little bit more oomph around there. But one thing I would remind the crew is, if we're overtaking a crew, that means we're already way faster than them. We've already caught up to them. So usually if you just keep doing what you're doing and you do it well and you don't get distracted, that's going to take you past that crew that you're trying to overtake. And that will take you over to the finish. So that's my kind of basic race plan. Feel free to steal it. One important question that we often get asked, which I would like to reiterate again, is about the language that you use in your racing. Generally, British rowing rules are that foul language is not allowed. I think that's even more hotly picked up on when you are somewhere like the Tideway, where there are a lot of members of the public, supporters that can easily hear what you're saying. These head races will hand out penalties quite liberally to people who use foul language, even if it's directed at their own crew. If a member of the public can overhear it, they could well hand out a penalty for that. If it's directed at another crew, that penalty is going to be even more aggressive. And bear in mind that a marshal, even if you think you're directing something at your own crew, a marshal who overhears it may misconstrue it. So just think about the language you're using. You can be aggressive and you can be powerful in your language without using any foul language, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally. And I'd say, just following up, like, it's a really simple race plan, but the big thing, we listen to a lot of race recordings, especially longer pieces like this. It can be a bit of a sensory overload for the coxes at times, and the race recordings, which are probably the most challenging ones to kind of hear back and manage, and it's hard for the coxes to hear it too, is often you think that you're sticking on one thing, but then you're like, oh, okay, and then there's a duff stroke, so you ask them to do something else, and then all of a sudden you want bow to do this, and then you jump to something else. Like, by doing the 20 stroke focus, it keeps you focused and it gives them time to make the change. The joy of a longer race is they actually have time to make kind of tangible technical change and stick at something. If you did 5 by 20 in a 2K, and we're talking about summer racing, well, you've kind of missed half of the race. Whereas you actually have time to do this. And whilst it might feel like maybe you're being a bit sort of boring by sticking with one thing, the athletes will actually really appreciate that, because they can actually get stuck into it. And the other thing is, if you're asking for some sort of technical change, is give them feedback on that too. We can often get quite distracted in a head race by kind of the next thing that we need to do, and we've asked them to make a change, particularly in that second half where they're going to be deoxygenated and in pain. Give them some good feedback when you're asking for technical changes. And the very last thing to say as well is, you have a job to do as well, and this is part of your job, but another really, really important part of your job is steering and race management. If something is happening ahead of you that you can see, and you need to tell them that you're going to be quiet because you need to deal with something, then please do that. A great example for me was, I started crew 51 with Leander. I had a lot of Olympians in my boat, and we caught up to the bottom of the previous division by about Hammersmith Bridge. I think I overtook something like 17 crews, and I ended up in an overtake situation where I was overtaking 3 crews at once going along basically the Putney embankment. And I was on my way. I could see the black buoy here, and I can see a log in the water. And I was like, this could be like an iceberg, and there'll be loads underneath. And I just needed to concentrate. So we were coming into, the pinnacle finish of our race, which had already been really kind of a big sensory overload. And I just said, you need to start the finish on the legs for 15. I'm going to go quiet. I need to steer. And I just was quiet. And we got through by the skin of our teeth. And then I was like, I'm back. Okay, on the feet, let's go. And that's so much better than just going ominously silent and everyone wondering what's happened. So feel free, if you need time just give yourself that time as well, because that will really help. The finish of the race. So the race is done. There are a couple different places that the race finishes. I don't know why that arrow's gone weird, but basically you've got Vets Head and Women's Head. You are finishing at Putney Pier. For the head of the river, it's the University Stone. They are basically in the same place. You don't really need to kind of get too up in your head about exactly where that is. It's going to be the difference of a couple of strokes. There'll be a very big banner saying finish. And I always think, if in doubt, row through the line. What's a couple more strokes on the Tideway? Then with School's Head, again, as we've said, kind of the sailing club, which is halfway along the Putney embankment, but that has not yet been fully updated. So just make sure you know where the finish is, but it will be very clear. What is really important is that when you cross the line, you keep rowing. So the first thing they want to do is chuck their blades away and kind of fold down into. They have to keep rowing. They can row really light. What I generally will say is I use, and I do this in training as well, if we've finished a piece but I want them to keep rowing, I give them a percentage. So I'll say paddle at 50% full slide, and just make sure that everyone's generally moving together and the flow of the boat just keeps moving. It means, especially if you've got lots of crews around you, you're moving safely. When you cross the line, keep rowing through both bridges until a marshal tells you to turn. They may, and it has happened in the past, if it's busy, they might let you turn earlier, but you only make that call when a marshal tells you to turn. On your return, then you'll pass in front of the Putney Pier and then tuck into that inshore zone. Be really switched on here. If you need to row sixes once you've turned, that's absolutely fine. But when you're doing that bit to tuck in, feel free to say to the athletes, I need you to switch on, because obviously by this point, they are very tired. They may not be too reactive, and you need to safely navigate with crews coming towards you round that Putney Pier and into the inshore zone. And then you are a little bit safer. What I would advise is, if you are not stopping at Putney, is to get them to flush the legs out and paddle beyond the embankment, because you'll have lots of crews wanting to land, and then you can stop. People can relayer, put some clothes on and roll through your sixes to get yourself home. It's really important that you do not impede any racing crews when you're getting home. So that's particularly if you're having to cross over the racing line. So make sure you only cross when you're instructed by a marshal, and when you do, you cross quickly or late. The only slight difference to that is for School's Head. This is the image from last year. So again, it depends where the finish line is, but ultimately you still keep rowing when you cross the line. And then the difference is you will not be going through the bridges. I believe that will be the same depending on where your finish is, but you will not go through the bridges, but it's literally exactly the same. You turn around and you get into that inshore zone basically before the end. So the key things are keep rowing and don't impede anyone else. We have had a couple of questions just coming through as we've been chatting. But just before we move on to them, we will make this available on our YouTube, so you can go back and have a look at anything that's particularly useful, whether that's racing line or having a look at what to bring. We are very happy to answer your questions as well. We'd also really appreciate, we do all of this for free. We give our time and we want to make coxing as accessible to everybody as possible. If you have the opportunity to, you can buy us a coffee. You can just scan the QR code. It helps us basically pay for Zooms, pay for stickers, and all those things that we like to basically give away and share. And if you do see any of us down at the Head, unfortunately, I'm racing for Leander at Women's Head, so I'm in a really awkward place and I won't probably see anyone, but we will have people down on Putney Embankment. So come and chat to us. Come and get a sticker.
Like pretty much every single one of those head races, I seem to have been able to work.
Nice. But if you see any of us, come and grab a sticker. But we do have some questions. So I'm just going to have a little look about what's come up. So I've had a question from someone saying, realistically, the crew will get passed a lot. And unlikely be doing a lot of passing other crews. Do you have any specific advice how to encourage a crew whilst being passed? I think that's a really good question, actually. I think using metrics that are relevant to you and your crew and your aims of kind of what your kind of performance goals are really important in a head race. not everyone is going there to win the pennants or win the overall head. You know, everyone is going there to have a good race. And I think sometimes it's really important to separate what like performance and result are. And actually, if it's about maintaining kind of consistency, if there's some technical focuses that you really want to work on, and basically kind of go, it might even just be kind of going the distance and focusing instead on kind of, okay, what makes your crew really good and what are they doing really well, even if they are being overtaken. I'd say it's kind of keeping eyes in, heads in, and it's like your rhythm, your race, because actually what that other crew might be going to go and do is not necessarily what you guys are aiming to do. And using different markers as well. So if you're comfortable with the markers and you see where you are, that's a really good reference point. But actually, if you don't feel super comfortable in the markers, but you have some sort of stroke coach, you can do it on distance and you can use time. So you can use lots of different sort of metrics to kind of race your own race rather than getting too distracted on other crews. Zoe, anything else to add?
No, I was just going to say, if you think your crew's going to be motivated by it, you can use a crew that's overtaking you in the same way that you might use a crew that you are overtaking. So you can say, okay, crew number X is coming up. Let's make this difficult for them. And then whatever your technical, let's really press out those strokes, press them away. Like make sure we give them a hard time. You can still use it as a positive motivator.
Yeah, totally. I've had another question about that, about kind of uni crews heads kind of can go down quite easily. Perhaps that can be actually the day, today is the day that you change that. Like that actually, one of the big wins is actually going to be that you race your hardest and you don't let the heads go down and you make that kind of be a little bit up for the fight and a little bit dogged about it. Once you're kind of getting overtaken, there can be, I think, some kind of funky things can happen when, a crew that should be overtaking another crew, but then you're trying to and you just can't because the elastic, that invisible elastic that keeps you with another crew, that can actually really motivate you. And also, like Zoe said, if you're getting overtaken and people are getting heads down, like give them markers being like, okay, yeah, you've held them here, you're still holding them here, like another 20 seconds, let's stick with the bow four or whatever, and kind of use that. And that's something that's kind of hard to prepare for, sorry. Another question is just, someone's never been on the Tideway before. You'd be crossing the river on the road back after the race. That's a good question. What you are likely to be doing is essentially you'll be following, providing you are not basically bumping then into marshalling crews if you're trying to get back to Putney, for example. But most likely, I've boated from UL in the first 50 and then I've not caught up with the marshalling crews, because by the time you finished your race, turned and come back, pretty much the whole race is kind of gone. What you'll be doing is essentially following the inshore zone. You'll be back to normal circulation on the Tideway when you are returning to the club. So have a look at what normal circulation on the Tideway would be. Then you basically know how you're going to get back safely, if that makes sense. If in doubt, there will be marshals. It's not like the race finishes and the marshals disappear. They want to make sure everyone gets home safely. So if in doubt, ask a marshal. And then another question just about if you're being overtaken from stroke side, they want you to move, but moving to the right would put you into the navigation buoys. Is it permissible to hold your line? Yes. So it is essentially, as I said, it's really important that both crews are responsible for not causing a collision. And that's not just between the two of you, but that's also other things on the Tideway. So that whether that's, a marshalling crew, a launch that's broken down, or a navigation buoy. So if you kind of need to hold your line because you have nowhere else to go, then that's really important.
If as an overtaking crew, you need to be aware of that. So if you are coming up to Barnes Bridge and there's already 2 boats abreast in front of you, which is as many as you can get side by, well, you can get 3, but not really. You can get 2 side by side through Barnes Bridge. If that's the case, don't, hold yourself back a little bit. Don't just go ploughing into the crews because there's nowhere for them to go. So wait until you're out of the bridge, holding off for 5 or 10 strokes and not colliding is going to be much, much quicker than going full pelt into the back of someone, because even if they get a penalty, you're not going to get that time back.
Yeah. And I would also say that, let's say you're in a position where you're feeling squeezed, you can communicate with other coxes mid race. If you just say, I need more room, I'll move out your way shortly, or whatever it is, and being aware if you're communicating between coxes during racing, it probably, again, it's like I said about the marshal shouting through the megaphone, it might feel a little bit frenetic and a little bit intense, but actually, assume that everyone's communicating with kind of goodwill, and if you need more space, ask for more space, and that sort of thing. I think with overtaking, there's an element of unpredictability around it, which is why it can feel a little bit nerve-wracking. But again, if you need to take time to assess your situation, assess your surroundings, and think where you need to be on the water, set them up with something really simple to be working on. You can go a little bit quiet and kind of manage that without kind of using all of your brain to think about what you're saying. And again, as Zoe said, is part of being aware of who's around you. So if you know that you have crews which are going to be maybe up your bum straight away, and they're kind of right up your bum as you're literally going through Chiswick Bridge, is making sure that kind of where they are, and if they're going to kind of plow through and try and overtake really early, is give them the space to do that so you can get back onto your course as soon as possible. How do you let another boat know you're overtaking them? So what? Yeah, talk to them. What do you yell? I like that. Do you yell? What can you yell? In America, they love the word concede, but I don't think you kind of need to get to that point. I think realistically, if you are coxing, you would expect your stern pair or your stroke to be giving you some information if you have a crew absolutely barreling up towards you and you haven't noticed. This is part of an awareness that all the coxers who are racing the Tideway, you should be aware of what's going on around you. You should be looking back to have a look at what crews are doing behind you as well. So ideally, no boat will have a stealth overtake because you'll hear it aside from anything else. If you feel like they haven't heard and they're not conceding, feel free to kind of call to them. You probably will know who they are. The cox has probably got the branding on their back, and you've got an awareness of who's ahead of you. Is basically shout to them and saying, like, we're overtaking, we're coming through on bow side or coming through on stroke side. That's sort of all that needs to happen.
I would say as well, remember that sometimes you will have a crew in front of you who is deliberately not moving, but more often than not, the reason why a crew is not moving is either because they don't know that you're there, because they don't have good enough communication with their athletes, or because they just don't know what to do. And so if you say to them, Leander, move to bow side, I'm coming past, then you've got a better chance of actually them doing what you need them to do to get past safely.
Yeah. I would like to think this will never happen to anybody, but one thing to note is if you do get into a skirmish, I had one where I had a crew basically there was a bit of a tussle in a vet's head that I did once, and we actually lost our bow number as well. I knew there'd be a fine for the bow number. Is that when we landed, there is a number that you can call to kind of report an incident, and I called just to say, just so this happened, it was around here, this was the crew. To be honest, it wasn't it didn't need a penalty, but they would be fined for not returning the bow number, and I didn't want them to have to pay to return the bow number, and also maybe hear another side of the story, and that exists for the kind of a good reason. There's one more question here. Just is there a general rule of thumb when I'm trying to position my target boat I'm trying to pass? I saw somewhere I should overtake on the left before Hammersmith, on the right after.
Yeah, I mean, broadly, yeah. But it depends where the other crew is. If the other crew is way off the line, then don't think, well, I need to get to the left or right of them. But yeah, I mean, and that's why you've got to really think ahead as well. So you want to be looking up ahead and thinking, okay, well, I might be overtaking that crew in a minute. So where do I want to position myself now to make it as clear as possible to them that that's the side I want to come on. Yes, broadly, it is going to be on those sides. But like I say, you're not just going to, if a crew is really, really tight in, you know, over the line, it's like a quarter from one side when you should be a third, don't just try and get to the left of them for no reason. You aim for the line first.
The big thing I would say is, you know, around other crews and overtaking, they are the biggest distraction to take you off your line. So race your line as if you're the only one there. And then if you've got crews around you, then that's when you'll need to kind of deviate and make a plan. A good example is when I made an error a number of years ago where I hadn't quite clocked. I knew we'd be overtaking, and they were very tight on the Surrey bend coming under Hammersmith. They would have been right on the buttresses as we were coming round. We would have been in the correct place. However, what I hadn't quite factored is I was talking about the weather early on, about how it was basically going to be wind against stream, and actually they tucked in a little bit more to be a little bit more sheltered, and the overtake, we were basically overtaking them on a little bit wide, and it took us forever. And that was a good example of me probably not forward planning and actually tucking in, knowing that we'd be overtaking in a couple of minutes time, in order to kind of facilitate and looking at the weather. We've had a question about the race markers. I think encourage them to keep their eyes in. If they are not super familiar with some of the more niche markers, then use references they do know. So if you, for example, if you row on a stretch that they know really well, you can liken, you know, okay, we're 4K in, this is where we would be here on our stretch. Let's push on the next K to do this. So if the markers aren't useful for, you know, your crew, because they're not super familiar and they're going to be looking around at things, then take the markers out of the equation, make them useful for you, but you don't need to distract them, because actually if they don't understand the course and saying, oh, we're at Barn Elms, but they've got no idea where Barn Elms is, then it's not going to be particularly useful. I think what we will do is we are coming up to an hour and 15, which I think should be a hard stop. So if there are any more questions, we probably have space for one more. But if not, we will wrap it up here. Nope. Lovely. Just thank yous. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming. We'll make this available on YouTube, and we'll send you guys the link as well. If you have any questions ahead of the racing, then do feel free to drop us a message on WOX, and also just tag us in all your rowing pictures. We love to see them, especially as you're getting ready for the Tideway as well.
And if you haven't already, then make sure you've signed up to our new newsletter. We're going to be promoting all our upcoming webinars on that, so you make sure you're not going to miss anything. And also we send out a little fun story, top tip, kind of some exclusive content on there as well. So the link to that was in the email that we sent earlier, but you can find that link again on our social media, and we will also send it out with the email with the recording link.
Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely evening.